A very warm welcome to lesson number 26 in our 50-part series on the law of evidence. In today's lesson, we will be talking about confessions. In the preceding lessons, we have spoken about admissions. Confessions are a category of admissions that apply specifically to criminal cases. So we will be seeing some basics of confessions in today's lesson. Now, I want you to have a look at the Bare Act. You will find in the Bare Act that admissions have been defined in section 17. However, when you start looking at the sections from section 24 to 30 that deal with confessions, you'd find that confessions have not been specifically defined. Therefore, it is important for us to gather the meaning of what a confession is by looking at a few judgments. We have already discussed this point in the preceding lessons 22, 23, 24, and 25. I'd strongly urge you to watch those first before watching this video. However, for your convenience, I shall repeat this for you once again. Okay, so an admission, as defined in section 17, is a statement that suggests an inference as to a fact, an issue, or relevant fact. Okay, so what is an inference? An inference is something that you draw. Okay, so it's not expressly stated, it is drawn. There was one more point that we'd learned from section 21, which was that admissions generally have to be self-harming, which means that section 21 tells you that the rule is that admissions should be self-harming. However, section 21 also gives you three exceptions. So in these three exceptional situations, it is possible to have self-serving admissions. So the three exceptional situations allow you to have self-serving admissions, which means the person who makes these admissions is benefited by making those admissions. Now let us contrast this with confessions. Confessions, as we know, are also a type of admissions, right? Because admissions extend from section 17 to 31, and confessions are a type of admissions that lie within the entire gamut of admissions. But what is the difference? If admissions are generally self-harming, you need to remember that confessions are always self-harming. So a confession is always self-harming. Point number one. Point number two, not only is it always self-harming, it is severely self-harming. Also, it is fatally self-harming. What I mean is that a confession is an absolute and unequivocal admission of guilt. The person accepts his guilt, okay? And there is never any inference. It is express. It is not an inference. Let me explain this to you through an example, okay? Let us say A is found murdered in, say, Chandni Chowk of Delhi, Chandni Chowk, on, say, 1st of January 2020 at 8 p.m. Let's say this is what the facts are. Let us say B is the accused. Now, if B makes a statement that I was in Chandni Chowk, I was in Chandni Chowk on this date and time, then you can draw an inference that, okay, then maybe he was the person who did it. Here you're drawing an inference. This would be an admission, okay? Because he's only said that he was in Chandni Chowk. It is self-harming. If he had said he was in China, it would have been better for him. That would have been self-serving. To say that he's in Chandni Chowk is self-harming. However, there must have been maybe 1,000 people in Chandni Chowk at that place at that time. This is an admission. On the other hand, if B says that I killed A in Chandni Chowk on the 1st of January, well, in this case, he has admitted his very guilt. It is not an inference, it is direct, it is express. And this is how you identify a confession. A confession is an unequivocal admission of guilt. Now, since confessions are not defined, let us look at a few cases or a couple of excerpts from cases to know as to what a confession is. So this point has been clarified in Pakala Narayan Swamy versus the Emperor, one of the leading cases. A confession must either admit in terms the offense or at any rate substantially all the facts which constitute the offense. And then he goes on to cite an example. The example that is cited in this very judgment is that an admission of a gravely incriminating fact or even a conclusively incriminating fact is not by itself a confession, which means just a fact that points towards the inference that somebody may have done something, howsoever gravely incriminating it might be, is not a confession. So the example he gives is that let us say the accused is the owner of a knife or a gun which was used to kill someone else. It was used to kill B. So simply the fact that A is the owner of this gun, well, this might be gravely incriminating. It might point towards his guilt. However, like I said, a confession requires to be unequivocal and it has to be direct. And this is not so. Therefore, a statement that merely suggests the ownership of the weapon does not qualify as a confession. For it to be a confession, it must admit in terms the offense or all of the facts which constitute the offense. Let us also look at a few cases which tell you as to what confessions are not. So, a statement which might at the most be described as suggesting an inference that the accused committed the offense does not amount to a confession. What is this? This actually is an admission. Whenever it suggests an inference, right, that's an admission. It is not a confession. A confession, as we learned, is direct. Let's look at some more examples. An admission of a gravely incriminating fact is not of itself a confession. We just saw that in the previous case as well. Simply an incriminating fact is not a confession. A confession must concede the guilt. Okay. Finally, where the accused admitted his complicity in crime merely by stating that he was in the company of the other accused, it was held that such a statement could not be construed as a confession of his involvement in the crime because he merely spoke of his complicity. The complicity basically is the term that refers to the accomplice, right? So when you say accomplice, so from here you get complicity, right? So complicity basically means that some people are involved together. There was a kind of a partnership, right, in executing their offense. So basically his involvement in the gang is not enough to suggest that he was also a party to it, or you cannot construe the statement of his complicity as a confession because his complicity gives you and suggests an inference as to his guilt, but he has not said it by himself in material terms. So I hope with this now you are clear as to what a confession is and how it differs from an admission. So let us have a look at section 24. Section 24 is the first section that deals with the subject of confessions in the act. However, it does not define confessions as we just saw. Instead, it tells you that confessions that are caused by inducement, threat, or promise are irrelevant in criminal proceedings, right? So you can also see from the title that confessions apply only to criminal proceedings, right? Admissions apply to both civil and criminal. However, confessions are a part of the admissions that apply only to criminal cases. So here's section 24 for you. I'd strongly recommend that at this point you pause the video and try to make some sense of this by your own self and give it around 2 or 3 minutes at the very least, and then proceed further with this lesson. So now let us break this down and study it together. What it says is that a confession made by an accused person is irrelevant in a criminal proceeding if the making of the confession appears to the court. Okay, it appears to the court to have been caused by any inducement, threat, or promise, which basically means that if it appears to the court that he has not made his confession freely, that his consent was not free, then any such confession is irrelevant. Okay, that's the first point. But what kind of confession and what kind of threat? It says having reference to the charge against the accused person. So a confession that has reference to the charge is what is spoken of. Suppose he makes a confession for something that he has not been charged with, then it is not affected by section 24. Let me give you an example. Let us say there's a person A who is being tried for, let us say, the murder of B. Okay, that means he has been charged under section 302 in the present trial. Okay, now if he makes a confession with reference to this charge that I murdered or something like that, and the court feels that it was made under some threat, under some inducement, then that is irrelevant. But if A makes a confession that he had committed robbery of C, you see, at this point, he does not have a charge of robbery. So, a confession that he makes here is not affected by section 24. Okay, so make sure you pay attention to such kind of details. Let us proceed further with this section. It should be proceeding from a person in authority. So, this inducement, threat, or promise should be from a person in authority. So let us say A is the person who is guilty of, or who's being tried for murder, and he says that he was threatened by a little boy that he should confess. Okay, so this is not something that works. It has to be proceeding from a person in authority. The person in authority need not necessarily be a government servant. It can be any person who is in a position to compel the person to make a confession. Also, this inducement or threat should be sufficient, in the opinion of the court, to give the accused person grounds which would appear reasonable for supposing that by making it, he would gain any advantage. So let us say, what is an inducement? An inducement is that you give somebody some sort of incentive to do something. So you induce him by offering him something. So you say, you can confess your guilt and I will give you this. This is an inducement. Okay. Now, the inducement should be such that the court feels that he would have actually relented to it. So let us say there's a person who has been charged under section 302 and he confesses his act. He says that, yes, I committed murder. Suppose the inducement was rupees 10, 10 rupees for was the inducement. Well, the court would not believe that this was the reason for him to confess. But maybe if this was followed by a couple of more zeros, well, then maybe the inducement may have seemed sufficient to have determined his choice of confessing. Okay. Also, you need to see this word called temporal nature. What is the meaning of temporal nature? The advantage or evil, right? So he has to gain an advantage or avoid an evil. Basically, have gain an advantage or avoid a disadvantage of temporal nature. Temporal nature means it is of worldly or material nature, right? Which means it is not of spiritual nature, right? So if somebody says, okay, you confess and God will be very happy because you were honest, well, that is not an inducement of temporal nature. It is spiritual, it is not worldly, and therefore it will not qualify as inducement under section 24. So it's important for you to remember that as well. And of course, this has to be in reference to the proceeding against him. So if any person offers him an inducement which is of temporal nature, then such an inducement causes the confession to be irrelevant. This is section 24 for you. It is a good idea to see section 28 after seeing section 24 because the two sections are quite closely related. So section 28 says that a confession that is made after the removal of the inducement, threat or promise is relevant. Okay. So basically what we saw in section 24 was that, let us say there's a confession, but that confession was caused by an inducement, threat or promise. Once it is affected by one such threat, inducement or promise, it is rendered irrelevant. Okay. But section 28 says that once this is removed, then the confession may be relevant. So let's have a look at the provision. If such a confession as is referred to in section 24 What do you mean by such a confession? The confession that was made under the inducement, threat, or promise. That's what is referred to in section 24. So if such a confession, as is referred to in section 24, is made after the impression caused has been removed, then it is relevant. I want you to notice one very important point here. The significance of the word impression. Let's think of it like this. Let us say B gives a punch to the face of A. Okay. I hope you appreciate that the impact of the punch goes beyond that 1 second where he punched him. Let us say it took him 1 second here, 1 second of impact for a punch onto the chin. But the impression of that will remain for perhaps a week or maybe 2 weeks. So here it talks of the removal of the impression, not just the threat, which means that let us say B had threatened A initially maybe on the 1st of January. Okay. And as a result, A had confessed. Now maybe B is caught by the police on, let's say A confessed on the 2nd of January. Now B is caught by the police on, say, 3rd of January. Now, does that mean that after the 3rd of January, let's say on the 4th of January, whatever A says can be considered free of any kind of threat? Maybe not. That has to be assessed by the court. Hence, it's in the opinion of the court. The court will have to see whether all the impressions of the threat have been removed or not. Maybe even after the arrest of B, A continues to stay or feel threatened. In that case, it still is not relevant. The court will have to wait until the impression of the threat or inducement or promise has been fully removed. So as you can see, these words are very important. Impression, opinion of the court, and been fully removed. So when you understand section 24 and 28, then you understand the significance of the consent in confession. Consent has to be absolutely free. That is when a confession is relevant. Otherwise, a confession is irrelevant. This point might be familiar to you even from the Constitution of India. Article 20 of the Constitution deals with 3 safeguards with regard to criminal law. As you can see, it uses the word offenses, right? So when you see offenses, then you can understand that this is specifically for criminal law. And then you have 3 points there, 20 sub clause 1, 2, and 3. I will not be dealing with all of them because only one of them is of significance for our present purpose. So let's have a look at that provision. In case you're curious, you can just pause the video and read these. It is always good to know these as a student of criminal law, as a student of law, or even as a citizen of this country. All right. So Article 20, protection in respect of conviction for offences. Subclause 3. No person accused of any offence shall be compelled to be a witness against himself. Now, what is the meaning of being a witness against himself? It means he has to testify against himself. It means he has to make a self-harming statement. You cannot compel a person to do that. And this is what is known as the right against self-incrimination, which is contained in Article 20, Subclause 3 of the Constitution of India. Okay, so as you can see, Article 20 is also in consonance with Section 24 of the Indian Evidence Act. So we basically understand the principle that a confession cannot be compelled. No person can be compelled to testify against himself. We saw that in sections 24 and 28 of the Indian Evidence Act. We've seen that in Article 20 of the Constitution. As we go ahead, we will see some provisions of the CRPC and more provisions of the Indian Evidence Act as well, which establish this point. Also, there are several leading judgments on this point. For example, you can take the case of Selvi versus the state, right? So when a person has to undergo narco analysis, there is an element of self-incrimination in it, right? So you have judgments which have also said that you cannot compel a person to undertake or undergo the narco analysis test because it might amount to self-incrimination. So as you can see, this is a very important and fundamental pillar as regards confession. I need you to remember this Well, before we proceed any further and look at the provisions relating to confessions in the CRPC and other provisions in the Evidence Act. To conclude the point, I think it has been quite succinctly expressed here that an accused basically must be a free man while making his confession. Before we conclude, I want to leave you with a little problem about some conflicting provisions in the Act. I want you to look at sections 132 and 147 of the Indian Evidence Act. Okay. Now, sections 132 and 147 might show you something that is quite contradictory. I want you to see as to how these might be contradictory to Article 20 and as to how you might be able to harmoniously construe them. So I hope you're aware of this term that is called harmoniously construe. You might have heard the principle of harmonious construction, right? Harmonious construction. It is one of the principles of interpretation of statutes. So basically, when you have two seemingly contradictory statutes, now what can you decide? You can decide that one is right and one is wrong, but that is not the principle that is generally followed by law. So the principle that is generally followed is that let both the laws survive, because let the laws survive rather than perish. So if there are two seemingly contradictory or conflicting laws, then we try to harmonize them. And this is called harmonious construction. Okay. So I have just given you an example of provisions that you might find seemingly conflicting. Maybe you might not see the conflict, but I want you to have a look at 132 and 147. Basically, 147 will take you back to 132, so you can just look at 132 and see as to how it must be resolved after this lesson where you saw sections 24, 28 and Article 20. With that, I'll end today's lesson. I hope this lesson was of use to you. Thank you so much for your patience. Good day.